Welcome to Diving Deeper Discussions. I'm your host, Randy Isaac, and I'm here on behalf of the American Scientific Affiliation. And we're here to discuss articles and book reviews that are published in Perspectives on Science and Christian Faith, which is the journal of the American Scientific Affiliation. And today, February 12, 2022, we're talking about two book reviews that were published in the December 2021 issue. And these book reviews are, first was by Simon Wing, who's of McGill University. And he reviewed the book by Elaine Howard called Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values that Move Us Beyond Fear. And the second is a book review by Blake Kent, who's at Westmont College. And he reviewed a book that was co-authored by Elaine Howard called Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion. Now, Simon and Blake will be with us later for the discussion, but right now we are delighted that Elaine Howard is able to be with us here. And so welcome, Elaine.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Randy. And wow, what a privilege to have two of my books reviewed by the journal. I just feel really fortunate, really appreciate the work that's been done here. So excited to be talking with you today.
And we're glad to have you. You've put out quite a bit, I think, since it's probably been almost 10 years since you and I met in person. And you've put out a few books since then. So we're pleased to see that. And your work has gotten a lot of visibility, and we're pleased to add to that. And I think there may be quite a few questions here, and might be a good discussion here about your books. So I think most of our members are familiar with you, or at least they know your name, but they may not know very much about you. So before we get into the content of the book, I'd like to just find out a little bit more about you. I do know you're at Rice University, so you must live around Houston, but I'll bet that's not where you're born and raised, was it?
No, I was actually raised in upstate New York, and I come from the kind of part of upstate New York that looks more like the Midwest than like New York City. So the sort of farm country piece of it. So my life was not like the bustle of the city, which most people think of when you say you're from New York, but really the stuff of cows. And I was actually raised on Podunk Road, if you can believe that. I remember. I remember.
Is that close to Albany? Albany area?
It is. Yeah, it is close. It is close, Randy. I remember ordering something. This was years ago online, and needing to make a phone call to place my credit card when we used to have to make a phone to. And the person on the other end said, what's your address of this credit card? And I said, Podunk Road. And she's like, really, ma'am, it's late at night. And I'm like, no, that's really the name of the road.
That's great. Yeah. So where did you go to school then? Did you stay there in upstate New York?
So I did actually. The university that was closest to my home was Cornell University. And amazingly, it was the only school I applied to. It was probably the only school that I knew of at the time. So I didn't come from a family where a lot of people had higher education degrees. And I applied. I was very fortunate to get in. I suspect that I got in on a kind of affirmative action in terms of my background. They needed to take a certain number of kids from the rural areas of New York State into the land grant portion of Cornell University. And that was really life-changing to me to go to such an esteemed educational institution. So very grateful for that.
That's great. So that was your undergraduate work. Where did you go on for your graduate work?
So I left Cornell as an undergraduate, did some things with campus ministry, did try to stint in advertising, and then went back to graduate school. And amazingly, the best offer I got for graduate school was again at Cornell University. I was actually kind of upset about that in some ways because I didn't want to go back to my hometown. But
you
it ended up being absolutely, of course you do. But it ended up being a great experience. And when you are a PhD student someplace, you experience the university in a completely different way than you do as an undergraduate. And so it was actually a good experience. I met my husband there. Years later, very, very glad that I went back to Cornell.
Sure, that's good. Now, your undergraduate and graduate are all in sociology. Is that how did you pick sociology? How did you get into that field?
So my undergraduate was actually in psychology and human development and philosophy. And when I left Cornell University and started working with university campuses in more of a pastoral role, I actually considered seminary at one point. And then I love to write, and I considered becoming a professional writer. I did a kind of stint in advertising, as I said. But I realized that the kind of stuff that I was reading really centered around kind of sociological nonfiction. So I was reading Peter Berger and Robert Wuthnow and Nancy Ammerman and W.E.B. Du Bois and other well-known sociologists. And I thought, wow, this is the kind of stuff that I really like. I really like thinking about group behaviors and how we act differently in groups than we do when we're alone. And I also just loved higher education. And I thought, I want to be a professor. And you need a PhD to become a professor. I had no idea what I was getting into and how hard it would be. And again, I was kind of naive about the whole endeavor, but sociology seemed like the right field to get my PhD in if I wanted to become a professor, given what I was kind of naturally drawn to.
Right. So it was based on your reading and you moved in that direction. So, but sociology is a broad field. How did you narrow it down to this specialty of religion, and when did that happen? Was that in graduate school already or later?
I knew I wanted to be a sociologist of religion, Randy, right from the beginning. So I really went to graduate school. I have a very deeply religious heritage. I was raised in both a conservative Baptist home. Our family was part of the General Association of Regular Baptists, who think that the Southerns are actually too liberal. So just to give you a sense of kind of an overview
that'll
there.
Calibrate it.
Yeah, that'll calibrate it for your listeners. Some of you will know deeply what I'm talking about, and some of you will have no idea. That's okay. And then another part of my family actually went to a Pentecostal church in the Black church tradition. So I have these kind of disparate influences on my spiritual and faith background, and so disparate that it made me want to study that kind of thing. And it made me kind of become curious about other people's religious backgrounds and how they mapped onto mine. I think sociology and scholarship in general in sociology of religion helps us put our own story in the context of other people's stories if it's done well.
That's very good.
I just got excited about that.
So your PhD thesis was already in this field?
Yes, it was. And then later on, I became very interested in race, ethnicity, and immigration. And the first book I wrote was actually about the Korean church. It's called Korean American Evangelicals, New Models for Civic Life. And then my husband actually is a particle physicist, Randy. I think you may know this.
Yes, I remember.
The other listeners may not.
Right.
And I just got very interested and curious about what scientists think about religion. I started noticing the kind of stereotypes that there are out there in the world about what religious people think about science and what scientists think about religion. And I remember one day I kind of had an aha moment where I thought I should study that. Like, are these most extreme views, the views of folks like the late Christopher Hitchens or Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris, are the neuroscientist, are these views typical of what everyday religious people think and what everyday scientists think about these topics? And started thinking about the possibility of my own skill set in sociology bringing some light to bear on these things.
That's fascinating. Well, your work has certainly brought you to encompass a rather broad range of issues here, but you keep the books coming a little bit. So tell us a little bit about these two particular books. What of all the different things you've done on religion and science, how did you come to focus on these two particular books? Let's take the first one, The Shared Values.
They're very different books.
Yes.
So I came to the shared values book after about 10 years of research on what religious people think about science. And in particular, I have studied, and our team at Rice University, I want to give credit where credit is due. I run a program on religion and public life at Rice, and our research infrastructure is run through there. There's about 30 scholars, students, postdoctoral fellows, others who work with me. And so those folks have done a lot of the work with me, and we publish lots and lots of research articles together if anyone wants to look at those. But our research over the 10 years showed us that, there are some pretty big differences in the US, just in the US, in terms of what Christians think about faith and science issues compared to what, say, Muslims and Jews, who are other two big religious groups in the US, although much, much smaller than Christians. And in particular, people who call themselves traditional Christians or evangelical Christians or conservative Christians, folks can go by all of those labels, have the most problems with science around particular issues. So scientific issues that seem to impinge on who God is and his role in the world, as well as who human beings are and the extent to which they're made in the image of God. And we just have worked over those topics over and over in our research group. And the kind of findings that we were finding over 10 years of research really compelled me, as someone who's been part of Christian churches all her life. I thought, gosh, as scholars, we have kinds of, I think, moral responsibilities to the communities that we're part of, to bring our research to them and really explain our research in understandable ways to those communities. I thought, here I am. I have all these connections to Christian communities. I really need to write a book that's specifically for a Christian community that doesn't have a scholarly audience, that really has an audience, is like a Sunday school book, a book that someone could read in their church in, 8 weeks of Sunday school lessons, really short chapters, discussion questions at the end. So that was the audience for Why Science and Faith Need Each Other. It's a very different book than my other books, which have been more for a scholarly or an educated lay audience. This book is very much for a particular kind of Christian audience. So very different than the Secularity in Science book. As you can see, I hope it's okay. I brought 2 copies here of these books.
Sure.
And you
can hand them out.
This Why Science and Faith Need Each Other. I don't even know if you're going to share the video or not. But it's a teeny book. See, it's like a little skinny book. And this other book is like, really big, and it has very small print. So it's actually much bigger than it looks.
Yes, I've seen it.
So that's very different books. And it's been, I'm a transparent person, and it's been a bit of a journey to write this book for a Christian audience, quite different than other things I've done. And I think it's had its real ups and downs. Right.
Now, as far as the secularity and science, so saying that's aimed at more of an academic kind of audience then, right? So is this just another little aspect of what you're going on, or how did you narrow into the secularity issue here?
So the secularity in science, what scientists around the world really think about religion, is very much the culmination, I would say, of the sort of second part of our team's religion and science research agenda. So one piece of our agenda is concerned with trying to understand what people of faith think about science. And primarily, we've studied communities in the US and to a lesser extent, the UK.
Right.
I spent a lot of time in my earlier research career pondering and studying what US scientists think about religion. And I really enjoyed that work. But I remember interviewing this scientist who his heritage was from India, came from India to the US to practice his scientific career. And he said, I asked him, to what extent do you think there's a conflict between religion and science? And as only scientists will, they sometimes attack the question. So other people groups that I have studied, very rarely sort of interrogate me as the researcher about the questions I'm asking. But this fellow did. He said, that is such a stupid question. this whole conflict between religion and science is something that you Christians in the US think about. But, as a Hindu, I very rarely think about there being a conflict between religion and science. I see all of my science infusing my spiritual life and all of my spiritual life infusing my science. And I got thinking, is this conflict paradigm something that's perhaps particular to the US scientific community because of the kind of religious and political issues that we have going on in this particular nation? Or is this something that is broader? And how would we understand the science and religion relationship if we varied both the scientific infrastructure by going outside the US, as well as the religious infrastructure by looking at nations where the dominant religion is not Christianity? So that's kind of how we got going. And that was a wonderful, fun project, a very complicated, difficult project where we studied 8 nations. We did surveys with about 40,000 scientists and then in-depth interviews with over 600 of them.
That's a lot of work. We're delighted to be able to talk about it. So let's go ahead and dig into the content here of these books, and we're eager to open it up for discussion soon. But I've got a few things I'd like to ask you first. Let's stick with this secularity and science book first. So just from what you were saying just then, the way that Blake Kent summarized it in his review, he says the main thesis of the book is that conflict between religion and science is an invention of the West. So would it be fair to rephrase that as saying that conflict is essentially cultural? It really depends upon the culture of the country, meaning there's a religious culture and a scientific culture, and it's that cultural aspect that really produces that conflict?
To some extent. Obviously, conflict is an invention of the West is a bit of a tagline that the publisher helped us with because it's kind of pithy. But, the truth is that these things are a bit more nuanced that one sentence would lead us to believe. So there are, of course, subgroups within these national contexts, but it is the case that scientists in the US to some extent and in the UK are more likely than scientists in other national contexts to see a conflict between religion and science. In France, this is the case to some extent as well, although there are very different kinds of reasons for the underlying conflict paradigm. But these are all nations where the main religious heritage is Christianity. Now, there are definitely conflicts between religion and science in Turkey, where we interviewed quite a few Muslim scientists, as well as conflicts definitely in Taiwan and Hong Kong and India. But in general, the sort of modal situation in those nations, which are not Christian dominant, is that they see religion, their religious traditions, and their scientific work as being much more compatible. And really, under certain conditions, especially in Taiwan, where there's a real religious plurality, and there's both Buddhists in large numbers and those who practice a variety of Confucian traditions, as well as folk religions broadly defined, there is a sense where religion and science are not even necessarily seen as distinct categories. So there is a kind of sensibility where knowledge is kind of one, and they don't see these things. Almost the question doesn't make sense in those national contexts in the way that it does to us in the UK and the US in particular. They
aren't two separate categories. They're kind of the same thing. View of reality. So thinking about that then and thinking about your other book, was the one of shared values then predominantly in the US or UK, or you just pick one region for that study?
So the why science and faith need each other is only addressed to the U.S. Christian church. So I try to make very clear in that book that the kind of shared values that I'm advocating for really are the shared values between Christianity and in particular, really conservative Protestant Christianity and science. The Catholic Christianity, I think, has a different kind of perspective, even in the U.S.
Yes, it's there. So there might be a few in this audience who are listening who may not have read the book or only the review or something, but maybe you could just articulate for the whole audience what those 8 shared values are.
You're so generous, Randy. I bet there's more than a few, but of course they should should immediately go buy it on Amazon. Yes, right. They've got an opportunity. Yeah. So I'll sort of walk you through the values. So there are the values that I call process values, sort of the processes of understanding one another and understanding knowledge. So things like curiosity, that both science and faith really rest on this value of curiosity, doubt, a sense of humility and creativity. And then there are 4 other values, which I call values of redemption, that under certain conditions, both the Christian community and the scientific community, and those who have a foot in both of those communities, share a desire for healing and for awe, something greater than themselves, for shalom, a sense to bring peace and wholeness to the world, and for gratitude for both scientific work and faith. And so those are the 8 values that have really come out of the work just in the U.S. and just in the Christian church over the past 10 years or so, and the ones that I call out in this particular book. Not to say that there aren't other values which are also potentially shared, but I made a kind of normative stand in this book, which is a bit different than some of my other work, where so, from everything that I noticed from my view, doing this much research, these are the ones really that our Christian community and the corners of our scientific community really want to focus on if they are to gain a sense of common ground with one another.
So how did you identify those values? Did you kind of pick a few values and go out and see if they worked, or did they kind of flow out of other questions you were asking?
Very much an inductive process for this particular book. Again, very different. My other work is much more, as I think some in the scientific community would understand it, much more hypothesis testing and building on an existing research base and going out and looking and see if you find different or similar categories as other researchers. But this particular book was much more of an inductive book where, based on all of the interviews that I've done with Christians over the years, both scientists who are Christians as well as just people, Christians general, as for what you might call everyday Christians, that these are the values that flowed out. And then I did a select set of interviews with scientists who are Christians that were selected from my studies. I went back into the research field and did some more interviews with scientists to get their commentary on these values and confirm my particular assessment of the social landscape of the values that might be shared between these communities.
Right. Now, in his review, Simon Wing was wondering a little bit about whether science and religion both needed all these values. But then it occurred to me that, at least from the title, you're saying science and faith and religion need each other. You're not saying they need these values, or how does this work?
I do think they need each other. So really the thesis of that book is that these two communities need each other to grow into their best and highest goals. I mean, as from a Christian theological perspective, we would think that all sciences flows from truth, which flows from God. And so there wouldn't even be a kind of need to separate the knowledge that is part of both of these communities. But I'm arguing very much from a sociological perspective then that arises from Christian thinking, that these are values which are needed in this day, given all that we have going on, if we want to see these communities really collaborate better with one another.
So if both science and faith communities focus on these values jointly, it would really enhance each of their experiences, both the scientific and the faith.
I think so. And I think that these are the values, again, which are most important right now. And it's funny, this book came out right as the pandemic was really going on. So it's been It's been, in some ways, I had this whole book tour set up, and it's been just a crazy, crazy time, which is why I'm so excited to be on your show and talking about this right now, because it's just been so hard to get this material out. But I did end up leading some discussion groups at different church communities about the book, and really kind of helping people walk through the material and imagining how they might use these values in particular in these pandemic times.
Right. And you structured the book to enable discussion. I think it's very good as well. So I'd like to move on to broader discussion. A lot of people have questions, or a number that were submitted in advance. We'll start with those, and I'll be reading those, and then we'll have a broader audience discussion later. First, we'll give first shot at the reviewers themselves. So first from Blake Kent, who reviewed The Secularity in Science, and he submitted, he said, the primary weaknesses of the book are the minimal synthesis of cross-national data and the limited discussion of how results fit within the larger secularization debate which the authors used to frame the book. Secularization themes are treated on a country-by-country basis, but only 7 pages of the concluding chapter attempt a synthesis, and that discussion is largely practical. Given the expertise of the authors involved, it feels like a missed opportunity for a more theoretically rich discussion. I would like to have seen, for example, discussion on whether the independence model, as opposed to the conflict model, is itself linked to secularization. The majority of the world's scientists may be at least nominally religious, but without explicit philosophical and theological work to engage science, isn't it probable that the independence model might just as easily contribute to secularization as to oppose it? In other words, whose secularity are we talking about? Strong atheists may view independence as accommodating religion. The highly devout may interpret it as another facet of secularity. A bit of a long question, but you want to tackle that?
I'm not sure that's a question so much as a statement, Randy, but it's a good statement. It's something that I think that's fair. We chose very deliberately not to center this book entirely on secularization. So secularization itself is very much a US-based, really scholarly concept. So this whole idea that as science expands, this is the way it's been most often framed in relationship to the religion and science, studies of religion and science, that as science expands, religion will necessarily decrease. And this is more of a philosophical concern. And we were not as concerned about that. So we are not as concerned about figuring out whether the expansion of science in particular nations would lead to the decrease of religion. We were more concerned with trying to figure out how scientists in different national contexts compared and how they understand their own religious traditions in response to their science. And that was kind of a deliberate move. It's one I think is defensible, and we feel comfortable with it. We have written from this larger project. It's called the Religion Among Scientists in International Context Project. And if folks are interested, on our website, which is rplp.rice.edu. So the initials of the Religion and Public Life Program.rice.edu. On our website, we have over 20 research articles where we delve more deeply, and some of them do deal more specifically with, how can secularity and secularization, say, be understood in India when compared to Taiwan and when compared to the US and things like that. To the conversation about the independence model, that is an interesting, I think, assessment, and one we thought about a lot as well. So when folks compartmentalize and say that religion and science are separate, which is some of the listeners will be very familiar with these ideas. So the late paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould famously argued that religion and science are perhaps, non-overlapping magisteria. They are two separate ways of knowing about the world. And Gould didn't make really any assessment in his little piece that became so famous about whether or not one is more important than the other. But as a sociologist, so someone who studies what everyday people actually think in the contemporary world, There is that view starts to really break down. It doesn't really make any sense. So we did ask those questions on the survey because we kind of have to, as religion and science researchers, to what extent you see religion and science as independent, as collaborative. But then what was so cool about this research, Randy, is that when we went into the national context and we observed what science are doing, even those scientists who see themselves as seeing religion and science as deeply independent, find it very hard to keep religion out of their scientific work. So you have, I remember one interview we did, which was just so funny. It was with this Italian scientist who, was very committed to the idea of religion and science being completely independent. He was a very committed Catholic. And so we went into his office to do the interview, and he has this enormous Bible in his office that weighs like probably 30 pounds. I don't know my pound to kilo ratio so well, but it was a honking big Bible. And he has an enormous, he had an enormous Catholic cross up there. Yeah. And it was really fascinating to me. Yet he thought of himself as keeping religion and science completely independent, but no one who went into his office would see it as being devoid of religious symbolism. So, and there was another example, again, in India, there are many scientists who see religion and science as independent. And Hinduism is such a diffuse set of traditions that you will find that there are staff people praying to and supporting the gods of scientific machinery. And there was one example where there was actually an anthill that scientists used part of the day for an ecological experiment. And then it had garland lay on it the rest of the day because staff people were using it as a spiritual site. And they really shared this particular natural feature on the campus for both spiritual and religious, for spiritual and scientific purposes, rather.
That's fascinating.
So these like ideal, typical philosophical ideas break down when you actually observe what people are doing. And I think that's so fun, what makes social science research so fun, and not to be held in contradiction with theological or philosophical or even natural scientific work, but really to complement, to say, like, do these philosophic and theological ideas that we have, how do they really appear when we're actually doing stuff? Do they hold up in everyday life?
And it's always a wide variety of perspectives too. Yeah. All right. So let's move on. Simon Wing reviewed the Why Science and Faith Need Each Other book, and he submitted the following question. He says, you propose that the recognition of many shared values between people of faith and scientists could overcome fear and suspicion between the two communities. My question is, the COVID-19 pandemic has increased suspicion of science by some of the faith communities that I believe you are addressing. How would you recommend addressing their suspicions regarding vaccines and public health measures such as masking?
Yeah, that's a very complicated question. So right after that, and a great one, right after this book was published, as I said, then the pandemic hit, and I spent about 4 months of my life doing nothing except writing op-eds, speaking on NPR and other radio shows, trying to convince people to accept what the science was saying about vaccination and the need for vaccination. And of course, we know that reliable surveys have shown that conservative Christians, and particularly evangelicals and white evangelicals, were real holdouts against vaccination in certain corners. And so it's a fatiguing and hard situation. Partly, I think we can understand this current social reality as the infusion of politics with religion as well. And so we are in a particular U.S. context where politics and religion tend to be very intertwined. And in some of my broader research, we found that people who are going to church regularly, so people who are part of church communities, whether or not they are Republicans or Democrats politically, are actually more science friendly, more likely to change their mind about things. We've done a lot of work in our group on climate change and evolution and some of the other hot button topics. It's the people who see their faith and their politics as very much intertwined, and their faith actually is driven by their politics. those are the folks who tend to be the most suspicious of science, and particularly we're against masking and things like that. And those people are folks who do not describe themselves as regular attenders, a group that we've coined as Fox News Christians almost. So being a Christian is kind of an ideology that is very much affiliated with a particular kind of conservative republicanism. So there's lots to unpack here, but I think we have not really sufficiently studied the extent to which politics is driving some of the decisions that people are saying they're making because of their faith, but it's a particularly politicized form of faith. And so all of that's happening, all of that's happening in our society, and all those factors are really mingled. So
there's no simple recipe to how to do this, huh?
Well, there are some things that research can show us, and some things that my research has shown over the years. One really important one, and I think, groups like the American Scientific Affiliation, groups like Biologos and Science for the Church, and these other groups, which are training scientists who are themselves Christians to learn how to interact with people in church communities. I think those groups are doing great work, and that my research would support that very strongly, that when people, everyday people encounter a scientist who is also a person of faith, that they're more likely to listen to that scientist because they share that common faith identity.
I see.
And sadly, in the science community, we've actually taught people to hide our faith identities. So it's it's a kind of catch-22 that the science community has become quite secular, in the sense that we can talk about other kinds of identities very openly, but we can't talk about faith identities. And I understand some of that. I'm sympathetic to it, actually. There has been some tensions and difficulties. But in this particular kind of time that we're in right now, Randy and the listeners, I think it's really dangerous that scientists have not been taught to speak more openly about their faith. Those who those who are persons of faith who could really be helpful in this situation.
Good point. Okay, let's move on to another question from ASA member Del Kuhn. Actually, two questions here, so let's take them as two separate ones. Del writes, I appreciated both books, especially that you're approaching the subject from a scientific perspective with data, not anecdotes. In Secularity and Science, you note that conflict between religion and science can arise from epistemology or morals. To coin a hopefully neutral example, a physicist opposed to research into or development of nuclear weapons shouldn't be considered a denier, as would be non-physicists who refuse to accept the Big Bang model of the universe, for example. In Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, you transition into the topic of moral conflict via medical and other applications. So the question is, does your survey data show differences within church populations between people whose conflicts with science are moral as compared to epistemological?
That's a great question. That's a really fantastic question. So the conflicts that we see now in the within folks who are, I would say, everyday Christians going to church tend to be more on the moral than the epistemological end. So what does that mean? So it's not that Christians or really anyone who has disagreements with science in our contemporary US society, it's much less likely that those disagreements will be based on things like, we just don't think science is good. We have a lot of mistrust of scientific knowledge. It's not so much that as it is that people are more likely to say that scientists are immoral people, that they don't have the same values as the rest of society, that they perhaps don't have good scientific methods, that their personal values or their political values are perhaps having an impact on how they're doing scientific work. So there is a real mistrust of science and the morality of science under certain conditions, and the morality of scientists. There's also a sense that, really the big frontier right now are genetic technologies and human reproductive genetic technologies, neuroscience findings. So particular findings that are attacking a sense potentially, and I don't think they necessarily really are, but in people's understandings, attacking the sense that humans are made in the image of God. Mm-hmm. And so that's, so we're getting into this real moral area. And I think it's very useful to understand the underlying reasons that people have for mistrusting science, and especially for mistrusting scientists as a people group, and how those vary among communities. So I've named a couple of times and just want to be more explicit about it. There's pretty big differences between white Christians when compared to Black Christians, who we know Black Christians have had what we call medical mistrust because their communities have been experimented on at the hands of the government. Yeah. And so they have understandable mistrust of certain folks in the scientific and medical community. And they have kind of what I would call a community of memory, where these ideas that you shouldn't necessarily trust medicine always have been passed down through communities. But in the pandemic, it was not primarily Black Christians who were vaccine resistant. It was tending to be more white Christians who were. And I think there were very different underlying logics for the mistrust of science in those two communities in particular. And that I think is really useful social science to understand some of those underlying dynamics.
Okay, that's good. So the second part of Dell's question is, similarly for the scientific population, in Secularity and Science, you quote a physics postdoc's concern that people who control science funding might bring their Christianity to bear on what gets funded. Does your survey have any insight as to whether non-religious scientists are likely to consider moral objections on their merits or dismiss them outright just because of a Christian or other religious basis?
That's a great question. I know you're discussing these two books, Randy, The Why Science and Faith Need Each Other and The Secularity and Science, but that particular question that was just asked was one that so captured our imagination that we wrote another book that just came out this year called Varieties of Atheism in Science. So the atheists in our particular sample of scientists from the 8 Nation study were very distinctive, and there were a lot of different types of atheist scientists. So I do think that there are some that really reject faith concerns or the moral difficulties that some have based on their own faith positions. They reject that out of hand, but some atheist scientists are incredibly friendly to religious traditions. And even wish they could be religious themselves. And so that book really, I think, takes a deep dive into the identities and practices of atheist scientists. So
did you say that book's out already?
It is. It's called Varieties of Atheism in Science.
Okay, maybe somebody in this audience is jumping to review it. We'll have you all back again on that.
You are too kind.
Yeah, that'd be great.
This is the Secularity in Science has quite a few different authors, wonderful folks who really took responsibility for that. The Varieties of Atheism book is with myself and a colleague, David Johnson, who's at Georgia State University.
Great. Okay, let's move on to another question from ASA fellow Ken Turian, who says, in the Judeo-Christian worldview, God is in intimate relationship with mankind and nature. Not so in any of the other major religions' worldviews like Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism. Is that why there is no apparent conflict between those worldviews and science? God or gods exhibit no direct personal involvement with mankind or nature, ergo no conflict between science and faith.
I'm not sure so much that it's that. So Islam, Judaism, and Christianity are the great monotheisms, right? Those particular religious traditions, especially Islam, you can find serious conflict between faith and science in certain corners of the world in Muslim situations or contexts where the dominant religion is Islam. So if we were having this conversation in a nation that was predominantly Muslim, you'd definitely be able to find a group of folks who see serious tension between science and faith. I do think theologically that the monotheisms have in common this pursuit of truth and the oneness of God. And so there is laid the groundwork for, there to be things that are not true and things that attack that central pursuit of truth through a one God faith. And so there is the potential for there to be conflict that's a little bit different than those religious traditions where there is not so much a centralized version of truth. So that's what some of my scientists told me, actually. An alternative Christian perspective, then, one that's laying the ground for conflict, of course, is the inclusiveness of truth under monotheism. So as as many have said in the Christian tradition, all truth is God's truth. So those scientists who didn't see there being a conflict tended to take that kind of inclusiveness of truth perspective where, science, as other bodies of knowledge, really flow through their Christian faith, and they don't see science as being in any way inconsistent with their faith as Christians and their scientific work.
Okay, and two more questions here. One is from a recent ASA member who recently joined us, Brenda Miller. And she writes, do you have any ideas to share about the use of storytelling, the arts, and humor to facilitate communication about faith and science? Do you know of any examples in success stories? And are there any resources you would like to recommend?
Oh, that's a really, really great question. I love that. It's very practical. So I would commend some of these bodies that I just said, your own ASA, but also I think BioLogos and Science for the Church are doing those two organizations have slightly different audiences. They're doing actually a lot of storytelling. So getting scientists out on the road, sharing their stories. I think both of those organizations are continuing to try to do more to diversify the group of scientists that they're holding up. So I think it's especially powerful when folks from predominantly Hispanic and predominantly Black churches see scientists who are both persons of faith, but also from their racial and ethnic background and cultural context. I think that kind of thing can be very, very powerful, and who are able to really talk about some of the challenges they've faced being underrepresented and really being sometimes doubly marginalized, both as a person of faith and as a person of color in their scientific work. I think that's true for women as well, that women are very underrepresented, especially my research has shown Christian women are particularly underrepresented in certain scientific fields. And so those folks, when they share their own stories, sometimes I think as scientists, we feel like, we need to, as one of the other questions alluded to, set like the epistemological standard, right? Like work out all of people's intellectual difficulties. But often the difficulty for young kids going into science is more of, feeling like people like them can't do it, or that they don't have any role models for how to do this. They don't have role models as persons of faith. They don't have role models as a person, say, who's a Black Christian. So, some of our work in the Religion and Public Life program at Rice, our outreach work with our research has been to facilitate some of these efforts to just get people, out there in faith communities talking about their scientific work. I think that'd be super powerful.
That's great. Thank you. Okay. The last question then from a long-time ASA member, Kerry Johnson. He writes, distrust of scientific expertise by people of faith, notably evangelicals, seems to have been exacerbated by identity politics surrounding COVID. What do you see as the long-term impact of the pandemic on attitudes by scientists about religion and by people of faith about scientists?
Yeah, that's a question just breaks my heart. And I think, it's whether you're a glass half empty or glass half full kind of person. I do think our reconciliation work on science and faith has taken a pretty big hit during the pandemic, because there have been some Christian churches, especially in my own Houston area, we're right in the buckle of the Bible Belt, but also one of the largest medical centers and research centers in the world is all in Houston, Texas. It's a great land for a sociologist like me. But there's a kind of sadness, I think, in the scientific community that some of these very large congregations have, come out against masking and not supported vaccination. But I would give, and through my research, our team has actually done a study in Houston on congregations and led by one of my graduate students, Brenton Kalinowski. And there we've seen just as many people who are using their churches to sponsor vaccination efforts and pastors who have just done incredibly difficult work trying to get their congregants the best health information and teamed with scientists. And so I think sometimes we report these very high level pastors who come out against vaccination or something, and we forget that I think the more common situation is religious leaders trying to be thoughtful and work together with the scientific community. I don't think there has been quite as much conflict as we would be led to believe by the most vocal folks that are in the news. And on the other hand, the scientific community sometimes doesn't put the right spokespersons out there. They don't put people out there who are able to really talk convincingly to faith communities. And so I would say that before the pandemic, I found it mildly annoying or even quite annoying that these two communities, by which I mean the faith community and the scientific community, don't understand each other and have massive stereotypes about the other. Now it's a matter of life and death. This work has really come into heightened importance, and it is really important that these two communities understand each other, have stereotypes replaced with truthful understanding, and that they work together for the common good.
Excellent points. Yeah. So you wouldn't be suggesting there's media bias, would you?
I do think so. I do think that it's very tempting to amplify the loudest, most negative voices. That kind of thing sells. There has been thoughtful journalism too. I wouldn't throw the baby with the bathwater, baby out with the bathwater. I hate that phrase. Who uses that? But that's what came to mind. But I do think there has been thoughtful journalism. But so I don't want to be sort of carte blanche against journalism. But there is, of course, that temptation to amplify the loudest voices, the most extreme voices, without doing careful assessment to get the lay of the land.
Right. Wow, this is terrific. You have done a tremendous amount of work here. There's a lot to talk about, and I know that there are many people out there interested in making their comments and their questions. And so I think Vicki would like to open up the microphones, and we can proceed with the audience questions. Again, the way we're going to do this is I'll give preference to the raised hands, but I will first call on two people if they want to say anything. I want to introduce the book reviewers to you. So Simon Wing, if you could unmute yourself and just say hello to everyone and make any comment that you like here, question or reaction of some type.
Yes, well, thanks, Randy, for having me, and I really enjoyed the opportunity of doing the book review, and also really enjoyed the interview that you did with Elaine Howard Ecklund. I think one thing that I appreciated from that interview, which perhaps I didn't notice in the book, when she said, well, why science and faith need each other? I guess she spoke about it in the interview more on a conceptual level, that science could be perhaps enriched and broadened by recognizing some of the ideas of the world that faith brings, and vice versa. So I appreciated that comment, and it added something to what I had read in the book. But that was great, though. I really enjoyed it.
Good point, Simon. Thank you. Blake, you focused on secularity and science. Any comments? Say hello to the group.
Hi, all. Great to be with you today. I did respond to a question in the chat that you may want to refer over to at some point. I think that I mean, Elaine is a wonderful scholar and colleague, and it was just great to have her on. But I guess a couple of comments. One, I'm not sure that I wish she had addressed my question about the independence model a little bit more directly, because to me it's sort of a question of is there a long curve to the scientific enterprise that either leads towards or away from the divine? And if you hold a complete independence model sort of at heart, and there's really very little or almost no philosophical or theological engagement into what's going on with science and religion, which the book reports over and over again is the case for almost all people that fit the independence model, then should you expect that the line is just going to keep going straight, or it's going to over time curve off to one side or the other? So it would have been nice to sort of hear a little bit more on that, but I'm very eager to hear if anyone else has thoughts on that topic. The second thing is, I guess, 2 points that I think she would probably want to pass on in terms of some of the conclusions or sort of summary or action points that the book closes with that my review didn't cover. The first is mentioned in the chat, and that is that religious scientists that engage at the highest level in their guilds, that are also explicit in their religious faith, play a really important role as what they call boundary pioneers. That a lot of the work in social science around this topic has to do with demarcating boundaries and who's in and who's out and that kind of thing. But people that are able to articulate and succeed highly in their fields have a really important and strong role to play. They note that. The second thing is really interesting, and that right at the end of the book, they say that scientists who are atheist or agnostic, even though they're a really small minority, are an important dialogue partner because they're the ones that are most likely to articulate scientism, or the idea that science is the best or only way of knowing things. And so they're an important conversation partner, and they don't really substantiate this. So it'd be interesting to hear some feedback. But they say, we actually believe that these scientists will not be leaders in the future science and religion dialogue. So even though that conversation is important now, they believe that those folks are not the future of what's going to happen with the science and religion dialogue. And that may have to do with the continued globalization and less of an exclusive focus on the West and the conflict model in the West.
Excellent points, Blake. Thank you very much. Again, for those of you who want to comment, talk about that, go to the reaction icon and click on raised hand. I don't see any. Oh, yeah, I see one. John Wood, you always have something to say. That's great.
Thanks, Randy. But this is absolutely delightful. To listen to Elaine extensively on this and to get a sense of the, Simon, as you said, to get a sense of the background of what she was, doing there. That really helps to put those in context. Very different audiences, and just very interesting to see her sort of parsing out what we tend to see as a unity, the scientists, the people in the church, and there's so much more going on. Anyway, I just wanted to comment that this last thing, Blake, what you just asked, the demarcation question, and the rest, I'll just tell you, this is a story. Somebody asked for stories. And this is the story is at Berkeley. When I applied to grad school, my major prof apparently had talked to my master's prof. And anyway, he said, John, we're ready to accept you. There's just one question. Berkeley is an evolutionary school. Is that going to be a problem for you? And I just a fascinating sort of key question that he would ask. And I said, well, Vince, it's not a problem for me if it's not a problem for you. And that was fine. But what I found is in the lab, I never said much about my faith. But repeatedly, both graduate students and faculty members would ask me to be an interpreter. John, what's going on here? These people are arguing about this. Or one professor, just a plaintive cry one day. I was his TA, and he said, John, tell me what's going on. these students come into my office and they try and save me. They keep wanting to talk to me about religion. And he says, I go to church, I'm doing these things, And you just see these two communities that are just like ships in the night, which is, I think, what Elaine's story is trying to address, is that we are just largely just passing one another and not really having the folks that can, and she said this, Biologos, Science of the Church, I think Reasons to Believe is doing the same thing. Scientists trying to reach out. And I just would end by saying that, the staff, as the pandemic started in ASA, we spent a couple of months calling, I think, nearly 500 of our members. And what we find, repeatedly in the ASA, we started with the oldest members and came down as folks are interested, that our members are interested in the kind of ways, how can I talk to my pastor? How can I talk to young people in my church? That was a really central theme, I think, that came out of our interviews with our members. So I found this really helpful today in giving us little, tips and clues and insight into better being able to communicate. So it's really fruitful. Thank you, gentlemen, for your interviews or your book reviews.
Your book reviews, right. Terry, you've got your hand up.
Just unmute my mic there.
Yeah. Come, Terry. Terry. We got two Terrys here. Okay. I'm sorry. Terry Gray was first. Sorry. You got them both hands up. I'm sorry I missed that. Okay. Terry Gray first.
So I just mostly a comment here, but I any of the reviewers who have a response to this, I would be interested in hearing, or anybody else. But I actually think that the response that it's an exaggeration of where we are now. Elaine, in her comments, she kind of carved out Catholics, and she carved out mainstream Protestants, and is writing from this very narrow evangelical, maybe even fundamentalist perspective, and we know that that's where there's conflict. But I'm when I look at the landscape, I'm much more inclined to say, well, we've got a few loud voices in the atheist camp, and we've got some loud voices in the evangelical camp. But by and large, those are extremes and not the mainstream. I mean, I really think, in my experience, that, the ASA represents sort of where most people of faith find themselves. Now, I myself will have some quibbles about, this or that issue about how to understand the Bible and how to relate science. And, some people at the extreme ends of that are going to say, well, okay, that puts you in the fundamentalist camp if you believe that. And, I kind of reject that whole extreme point of view. But that's how I was struck in reading. Reading the review and reading her comments.
Terry, I agree to some extent, and perhaps the ASA membership is a bit disproportionate, because I find when I talk to ASA members around there, a very significant, I don't have any data, but a significant percentage of the members I talk to are members because they grew up or came out of a conflict model, and they struggled with it, and they felt that ASA was a community that they could learn and deal with it. So perhaps we as ASA are more aware of the conflicts that exist, and it seems pretty extensive to me. We can call it fringe, and in a way it is, but yeah, it depends on the audience you're talking to.
I mean, I think if you look at the, say, the State University crowd, I don't think you have near the antagonism to Christianity.
I agree with that. I agree with that. I think it may be much more pronounced in the humanities than in the sciences. But okay, let's move on. We got to give you more things. So Terry Defoe, sorry, I got you mixed up there before, but Terry, go ahead.
It's good to be part of the discussion here today. I'm a Canadian pastor. I'm an evangelical. I've been an evangelical for 40 years. I apologize for my voice. I've got Parkinson's, so I just let people know that's why my voice is what it is. I've been a part of a denomination called Lutheran Church Canada, which is a young earth creationist denomination, sister church to Lutheran Church Missouri Synod in the U.S. And I've written a book about my transition from young earth creationism to evolutionary creation. The way I understand it, and I quoted Dr. Ecklund in my book, is that approximately 1/3 of the U.S. population believes that the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. That's a big section of the population. Not maybe so much as a percentage in Canada, but what I have found is that the reason the evangelicals who are young Earth creationists hold so strongly to that position is that they have a hermeneutic. That's simply, the science of interpretation of Scripture or any document that says to them, according to biblical authority, you have to take the Genesis account literally. And so the reason they hold so strongly to that position is because they feel like if they change it, they're giving up their Bible. They believe that it's eroding their biblical authority. And so it's a matter of ideology over evidence. I have found folks in my own denomination, pastors who come out of the woodwork and said, Terry, I totally agree with you. Even a seminary president has said that to me. But I hesitate to speak because there's sanctions to be applied. In other words, the right hand of fellowship can become the left foot of fellowship. There. So in my book, I've tried to lay out all the different positions that people of faith have taken and tried to tell folks that, presuppositionalism is not the way to go. When you presuppose that your hermeneutic is the only correct one, it's the gold standard and no one else is correct. Folks like John Walton have been helpful to me, as well as Dennis Lamoureux from the University of Edmonton, or University of Alberta. But I apologize for my voice, but I just want to say that as an evangelical, I've lived within that community for a very long time. And that's the root of the problem, as I see it. And there's certainly other areas that are part of this discussion. But a lot of the science denial that you see, whether I'm right or wrong, I would lay that at the feet of some folks like Ken Ham and so on.
Terry, thank you so much for your comment. I think that's spot on. It's a very important one for all of us to consider. And your voice is great. Thank you for sharing. And thank you for telling us about your book. I hadn't heard of it. And I think it could be very valuable to many of our members. So thank you.
What I found with that, I just wanted to add that Daryl Falk has written the foreword to it, and several ASA scientists have done that. But I just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, let's see. Where's our editors? Did that get reviewed? All right. So, Bill, I can't see your picture. I don't know which Bill you are. We've got a number of Bills around. Any chance are you able to get a camera? If not, let's at least hear you. Oh, there you are. Hi.
Okay, I think many of my questions have already been addressed somewhat, but I'll just briefly ask them either in the chat box or elsewhere. But so I was interested in drilling down on this kind of conflict sense. And so the first question, and I think it's semi been addressed in the chat, is whether there is a distinctive amongst branches of science. You can think broadly in terms of the hard sciences versus softer. By the way, as I consider biology as soft science, just to make it clear. And then also, and this is sort of interesting, I haven't heard anybody address this. We hear a lot. Now, I don't know how much is how reliable this is, but we hear a lot that men tend to compartmentalize their lives more than women. Now, I don't know if that's just a cultural feature, but if it is possible, if it has some basis, even if it's only cultural, it might be interesting to see whether there's distinctives relative to sex.
A couple of great questions there. Boy, who wants to tackle that? Simon or Blake, did you see anything in the books relating to that, or want to make any comment, or anyone else? While you're thinking about that, let me comment on your first part about the different sciences. I think there is a difference, but I have no real data to go by. It's just personal anecdotes, and that doesn't count for too much. But anecdotally, it kind of seems that physicists don't tend to see the biggest conflicts. You get more of them towards the biology end, and of course, much more towards the humanities. But it does seem to vary somewhat with discipline. I've found, interestingly enough, in the engineering community, seems to have a higher percentage that sees a conflict. But again, that may be a very erroneous sampling that I've got. And maybe it's just inappropriate stereotyping that I see, so I don't want to engage in it too much. But about the gender distinction, I don't know that I've seen any data or any indication of that. Does anybody else? Anybody have any data there or any indication? Nobody's done that. We'll have to tell Elaine. Or Simon, you want to say something?
Yeah, just to say that, Elaine didn't address that question, which I think is an interesting question, but whether there's a gender effect directly in her book. But I did notice that, she was quoting from both, her interviews with both female and male scientists, and they could take, both sort of positions in terms of some seeing conflict, others not. And there didn't seem to be any gender increase in proportion in one gender or another. So I can't answer the question with data, but certainly from reading Elaine Ecklund's book, there didn't seem to be that.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, I see, Janelle's next here, but first I see in the chat somebody's asking for the name of Terry Defoe's book. I hope somebody can look that up, put the URL down or the title in there. That would be helpful, then that will go into the archives. Well, Bill, I guess we don't have definitive answers to your questions, but they're good ones, so we'll have to.
Randy, I'll just jump in. It's very a very small point because Elaine doesn't tackle gender as a central sort of category of analysis in the book that I reviewed, but it is very well documented, of course, that in Christianity in the West, that religion is gendered and that men are less religious than women are. And she concludes at the end, and I also made a note of this in the chat, that that those that see religious science as most in conflict in the U.S. tend to be men at elite institutions that are later in their careers. And so she thinks that group is going to, obviously the demographics are changing in terms of who's represented in those institutions. So I think that that's a small hint at her conception that gender may play a role in that, sort of the decreasing influence of essentially advanced white men at elite institutions is going to change the dynamic of the conversation a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Janelle.
I was going to respond to the question too.
Janelle, you're cutting in and out a little bit.
Okay, is that better?
Yeah, it is. Thank you.
I think there's a lot of good research out there on gender and science that you could draw implications from, but I started thinking about Mary Stuart Van Leeuwen's book on gender and grace about the fall and how she would argue that the fall led to men desiring power and women becoming enmeshed in relationships. And I think if that would be an interesting way to think about how does that lead to different views on these issues of independence or not in science.
Okay. Thank you. Good insight on that. Anyone else? We just have a few more minutes, but there's time. Anyone? Any other reactions to Elaine and her work? Anything on your minds? Okay.
If I could, sorry. If I could, go ahead, Paul.
Question, just quick thing. Will we be able to get questions to Elaine later for her to answer?
We have not made arrangements of that type. It's not infeasible. We haven't done that before in terms of after follow-on. I don't know what their schedules should be like. We can try it, but it's not part of the program per se to have a follow-on. We have questions in advance and during the program, but you can always send it to Diving Deeper. We can always try. It doesn't hurt. Whether we'll get something or not, I don't know. Okay, someone else wanted to. Paul Arvidsson, I don't see your hand up, but I think
I was going to say something. I was going to say something here, Randy. I read it.
Okay.
I'm not sure if I've read the bigger book that was just reviewed. I read one of her books though a few years ago, and I thought it was quite good. She had a very good insight into how scientists think about religion, and the fact that she's coming from a faith tradition herself let her parse things that many other people just don't parse properly. And so I was very encouraged by her research. You know, when people tell her something that is related to faith, you know, she can understand what that means and understand the nuances where many of the, you know, atheist or secular researchers just don't quite get the nuances that believers are saying.
I think that's great, but can you give an example? Can you think of something?
That's what
where
my wife just said, and I can't think of an example.
You put it on the table, and you don't even have an example. You know, wives have good insight. It's true. So, yeah, she nods. Let's see. I see. Bill, are you having a raised hand again, or is it not? Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, it was Janelle's comment that makes me think that after listening to Elaine, I still don't think we're drilling down deep enough to really understand the distinctives. We all believe it's caused by something. There's something that we can maybe categorize that accounts for why some see a conflict and others not. Somebody else here, I can't remember who, spoke about the hermeneutic relationship that we feel we have with Scripture. And that was an examine. I'm just coming away with lots of questions, but a few answers, I guess, is my point.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's good. Now, Paul Arvidsson, were you looked as if you were going to ask a question? Did I misunderstand that?
Yes, I just wanted to know if I could follow up with Elaine on a.
Oh, that was you. Okay.
Yes.
Well, we can try. Okay, let's see. Any other comments? If not, I think that makes a full day with a lot for us to think about. I thank you all very much for joining us, and we hope to see you all next month on March 12, and we'll talk about Susan Benecke and astronomy, life, and the cosmos. Okay? Thank you so much. Bye-bye.